Right now, I want to welcome and introduce Dr. Gabrielle Roche McNally, who is our AFT Women for the Land National Initiative Director. And in that work, she works with a diversity of farmers and landowners around the country. She has a couple of terrific guests who are joining us for this conversation about working with diverse communities. And so without any further ado, I'm just going to hand it over to you, Gabrielle.
Great. Well, it's so nice to be here. I am really excited to see this training come to fruition. While I haven't been able to join all of you for most of the day today, I have been part of the team that helped to design and work on this training. So it's fun to see it actually come to birth or come to life. And I am part of the evaluation team as well, having a social science background. So you may hear a little bit more from me on that point, or probably mostly Chris and Beth, but I appreciate everyone taking your surveys and in dialoguing with us now and down the road about the ways this training has impacted you. So thanks so much. So I'm just going to share my screen. I only have really a few slides of kind of a formal presentation, and then I'm really going to start a dialogue with my guests, Michael Carter Jr. and Jean Eels, and I'll properly introduce them and pass off some questions to them here shortly. Just as a kind of reminder of why we're here today, I want to talk to you a little bit with Michael and Jean about reaching and working with a more diverse set of owners and operators. So I hope you walk away from this session with an understanding of kind of some of the issues that are specific to certain owners and operators. Obviously, you could do a whole college course on this topic, and we're just doing a really short dive. So, and I wanted to emphasize a couple landowner producer types in this conversation that we thought would be important for you all to have a little bit more information about. As we learned from the survey that we did with all of you, there are a number of you who are looking to or already working with kind of a more diverse group of landowners and producers. So we're going to emphasize this group of non-operating landowners, folks who might be considered by the USDA socially disadvantaged. Other people might use the language of sort of BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, and people of color producers, and then women. And I'll talk a little bit more about kind of what I mean here. So just to plug Women for the Land, and just in case anyone wants to learn more, but I do wear the hat both as a social scientist, but most of the time here as our initiative lead, and we really focus on engaging women farmers and landowners, both in protecting their land and stewarding that land. And of course, we're also interested in kind of supporting people to be successful so we keep farmers on the land. So many of you might already be familiar with how the USDA kind of identifies this term socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers, but I wanted to bring it up here just to kind of to give you a sense of kind of how that's framed. But usually, you know, I don't want that definition to limit us, but it is one way that it's very clear how it's sort of coded both in kind of federal NRCS and USDA work, but also many states follow a similar kind of definition. So usually folks who are considered sort of racial and ethnic minorities and who have been subjected to prejudice because of their identity. Oftentimes there are specific programs for veterans included in this group. I won't be speaking to veterans issues here, but another really interesting audience to sort of engage, and AFT is doing more work in this space. And I'll just note that most often women are not included in this definition as a category in and of themselves. Women who fall into these other categories are included. Often a lot of our work is sort of trying to reach all women and women with a diversity of identities in getting more resources and programming for them. So just kind of wanted to set that frame for you. So maybe why is it important to work with diverse landowners? Again, I'm not going to say the definitive answer to that, and I hope you all have some really good ideas about that yourselves, but I just want to kind of paint a picture for you about how important it is to kind of think about the diversity on the landscape and how a lot of our programming and sort of mainstream ag spaces have kind of left key audiences out oftentimes when we're working with landowners or producers. So Often we talk a lot about sort of the rented land complex and land that's majority owned by non-operating landlords, folks who lease out the land to a farmer and have maybe a lot to do or a little to do with the land. Nearly 40% of agricultural land in the US is owned by this group, and around 40% of that number is women owned. In parts of the country, that number is much higher, as much as 50% or more. So when we talk about sort of this important partner in land preservation, land stewardship, these non-operating landowners are a critical piece, and I'll dive a little more into them. We also know that about 36% of our country's producers are women. And if you look at all of the operations in the US, based on the most recent agricultural census, more than half of all farms in the US have a principal female producer. When we look at sort of the diversity in terms of racial and ethnic minorities, the statistic is maybe less impressive and frankly pretty disturbing when you look at about less than 2% of agricultural landowners in the US are non-white. Obviously, depending on where you are in the country, that statistic obscures it because there is parts of the country that those rates are much higher. But I'll talk a little bit more and invite my partners, particularly Michael Carter Jr., to kind of elucidate some of these statistics for us. But the final point I just want to make is that we know the future of farming is more diverse. It will more and more women are getting into farming in the new and beginning farmer audience, and many of those folks identify as with diverse racial ethnic identities. So why non-operating landowners? We've done a ton of research in this space, and I won't bore you with all the findings from that in this presentation. Happy to chat with people offline or in other contexts if you work expressly with this audience. But we just know how important this audience is. Based on our own large research project, we found how important keeping land in farming and preserving the farmland base is to non-operating landowners, both men and women. And so we know that this audience often is sort of underrepresented and under-engaged in farm preservation programs, farm stewardship. So I raise this as an important audience, and Jean will talk a little bit more about this audience, and she's done quite a bit of work in this space. And then when we kind of think about women, you know, depending on where you are and what you've experienced, I always think it's important just to remind people of the fact that many women, regardless of where they live or what their level of education or whatever their identities are, face a lot of barriers in the agriculture and land preservation space. I've got a few quotes here of women who've joined learning circles, these peer-to-peer network sessions that we do at AFT. And you can see there's still a lot of women who are going into places and have to remind folks that they're the landowner, that they're the decision maker, go into spaces where they feel like it's a good old boys club they can't access. So we've tried to create some sort of spaces for women to gather and share and learn from one another. But we've really acknowledged that often in sort of mixed groups, we don't get as many women participating and engaging in some of the programs that we do unless we really focus on engaging and recruiting them to our events and activities. A couple more key facts just to kind of highlight some of the issues. And again, Jean and Michael and I will talk more about this, but I did find this interesting piece on, I think, limited research in terms of the statistics, but what I saw from some of the ASAP easements, nearly half of those are held by women or women-run organizations. That's during the years of 2014 to 2019. And I asked our Farmland Information Center to help me get those numbers. So I thought that was interesting. Women who are primary producers tend to represent a greater kind of racial and ethnic diversity than their male counterparts. When we looked at kind of interesting research project, kind of looked at farming still as one of the most unequal professions in the United States today, certainly along gender lines and of course as well as racial lines, which I'll get into a little bit more in a moment. And then women-run farms, on average, they're operating smaller acreages and are earning much less income than farms operated by men, even if we control for some of the other sort of production characteristics and operator characteristics. And this may or may not be really surprising to anyone, but lack of access to childcare and sort of women's sort of care duties in the household can often really impact their ability to advance skills in agriculture and grow their businesses. And of course, this isn't true just for agriculture, but it does impact agriculture quite a bit. And so just wanted to sort of provide some of these to give you both the scale of some of the challenges women face, but also some of the opportunities and sort of put a point on how important this audience is to reach. Again, I'm using this term BIPOC producers here on this slide. For those who aren't familiar with that term, just to clarify, it stands for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And when we think about kind of the challenges that this community, which is not monolithic, faces, which are many, I wanted to point out a couple of things here. Many of you may know about heirs property issues. It is kind of a fractionated property rights where land is not clearly delineated to future heirs. And so there are many people with claim to the land, and often those heirs properties make it really are very, very susceptible to conversion to non-farm uses and to kind of legal challenges, financial challenges that kind of keep that land either from being held by the family and traditionally more low income and BIPOC producers owning that land, but also it requires some resolution in the courts and with lawyers to sort of address these issues. I share a screenshot here of this Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act. You can see the states which have adopted this, and it just points out areas where policies have been acted to help resolve heirs property issues. Again, this could be an entire course, and I'm throwing this term at you that some of you may not know, hopefully many of you do. I just want to kind of highlight how critical this issue is for a diverse audience. It approximates sort of 3.5 million acres across the South are affected by heirs property, and more than a third of Southern Black owned land. So, we're talking billions of dollars in value. And this is a critical issue that affects folks' ability to both hold on to the land, and if we're thinking of the context of protecting and stewarding that land, provide some more challenges. And then some of you might be aware of some of the direct discrimination that's happened for producers who are particularly engaging the U.S. Department of Agriculture for resources. If you want to learn more, the Pigford versus Glickman decision, which was the largest civil rights payout in the United States history, to address some discrimination that predominantly African-American farmers have faced in accessing resources with the USDA. So we know these things have happened, and we know that they still happen. And so when we think about some of the challenges these community faces, this is kind of what we have to reckon with. And then just really quickly, land loss, when we just look at African Americans, it's estimated that 90% of the land that was in the hands of African American families at the turn of the century, 1900s, what has been lost, and billions of dollars of kind of wealth that represents. And there are some efforts. This is not necessarily something that AFP is doing active work, but I just wanted to sort of to highlight to this group that there's work to do land back and reparations work. Soulfire Farm is a great resource in this space to learn more about kind of reparations in the land space. I'm guessing some of my guests here today will talk a little bit more about this. So I'm going to stop talking because I just wanted to basically frame out some of the core issues that I think Michael and Jean will put a pin on and explore with some more depth and their own experiences working with a diversity of owners and operators. So I want to invite my panelists, Michael Carter Jr., who is our Virginia Cooperative Extension Small Farm Outreach Program extension agent at Virginia State University. And he was also honored as a Small Farm Agent of the Year in this past year. So congratulations, Michael. And he'll share with you, but has a family farm doing really wonderful work, both kind of growing food, but also doing a lot of community education and outreach on many of the topics I've raised here today in a much more in-depth way. And then I want to invite Jean Eels, who I've known for a number of years now, working with some connections with Women, Food, and Agricultural Network, She runs her own consulting firm, e-resources group, and has been doing it for a few decades now, and has really kind of written the book literally on some of the work to do with women landowners, and specifically around conservation and many of the things that we have been talking about in this training. So I'm going to, what I'll do is, I think I'm going to end up putting the questions in the chat, both in Pathable, and I'll do it on Zoom. That way I can stop sharing my screen and encourage folks to kind of see the faces, but just be sure you have speaker view on in Zoom so that you can see folks talking. But I'll just kind of frame out the first question, and I think I'll pass it to Michael Carter Jr. first. And I've asked him to kind of think about, you know, some of the lessons learned that you've gleaned from working with and engaging diverse producers and landowners. So I'll pass it to Michael and then have Jean follow up. I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll put the questions in, that way people can track them. So Michael, are you with us?
Thank you all. Thank you for inviting me today. I dare say, I mean, there's a lot of lessons to learn from working with social disadvantaged farmers and non-traditional farmers. And I think probably the biggest things I've learned is just that I don't know a lot about, you know, the various circumstances. I'm a child of a farmer. I'm a fifth generation farmer on our land in Orange County, Virginia. And growing up on a farm is a lot of things I didn't know, or growing up around a farm is a lot of things I did not know. And didn't know until maybe 2 or 3 years ago when I started to work in extension and got better understanding of conservation programs, land ownership programs, things you can do with your land. And Carter Farms and Agriculture does a lot to try to educate individuals on that as well. Other farmers who may not know as well. This becomes a challenge because many of us don't know, you know, assume that because you have land and because you have a farm, because your family's been farming, that they know. And if they don't know, then it's going to be, you know, a challenge for them to get information to know. And there's a lot of, what's the word, this hesitation or fear or hesitation, especially amongst the African American community, in learning about these programs and applying those programs, because many times we're looking at individuals that's going to, ideally, in our mind, thinking that they're going to take the land or take advantage of us because of a history of foreclosures, of unfair trade practices with the USDA and with other organizations where I've seen many of farmers' lands foreclosed upon. There's a lot of trepidation and a lack of trust. And in this lack of trust, you have a deficit in terms of how you move forward in really reaching this audience who needs it the most. Bridging this trust or bridging this, you know, it takes a lot. Just like any bad relationship. If you've ever been in a bad relationship or know someone who has, it's tough to really trust the abuser. You know, especially if you've been abused for time upon time upon time again. You have to prove your trust to that individual. And for many Black farmers, you're talking about 150 years of mistrust, of a lot of mistrust, a lot of abuse, a lot of really doubt, a lot of trickery from the federal level, the state level, the local level, the county level, farmer to farmer level. So there's a lot of doubt and mistrust amongst family. We are owners of an air property, and I'm not even the owner of the air property. I'm a son of a heir, so I won't be able to be an owner until when my father transitions. That's when I become a owner of that property. And there's still mistrust and misgivings there. So those have been a lot of the things that I've experienced in terms of working with farmers, especially Black farmers, about how they deal with the land, how they deal with the level of trust, the opportunities that's there. And I get a lot of calls pretty much every day about young people who say, I have this land, I have access to this land, I want to do something. One of the great things that has come about is that, you know, with the rise of social media, there's a greater interest in trying to do more with land. There's a great interest in trying to grow small crops, try to do small herds, conservation livestock, herds, breed livestock, just wanting to do more with it. And there's opportunities there. I always say hemp is a great way plant to agriculture. Legalization of hemp happened in Virginia 2 years ago, and I get calls weekly on how to start a hemp farm. how to start growing hemp. So that's a gateway, and I use that gateway to educate individuals on the other opportunities in agriculture and land ownership that's needed to understand how to, progress through this agricultural industry. Because in the state of Virginia and in the country, rather, I guess agriculture is roughly about 99% white. So there's a lot of us who have no understanding of what the agriculture industry is and could be, because we just don't have a cultural connection to it any longer. Most of our perceptions about agriculture comes from slavery. And this perception of agriculture keeps us away because no one wants to be associated with that period of enslavement, of picking cotton, of doing the dirty, tough work and not getting any money. That's another thing that I've learned from our producers, is that they never show how you make money in agriculture. And that's always a turnoff for young people, because the reason why we want to work and do anything is to earn a living and make money and support our family. And if someone is saying we never make any money on something, and it's, I work 12 hours, I'm sweaty, I'm tired, I've been baling hay, I've been dealing with cattle, I've been, picking weeds, hoeing, track, all of that. And, all I got to show for it is about 13 cents in profit. That's not an inviting situation. So we have to do a better job of showing how you can earn money with your land and with in agriculture in general, but especially with your land. So those are just a few of the things that I've learned. I won't take up all the time.
Thank you, Michael. I'll pass it to Jean to pick up some of the lessons that you've learned working with women and non-operating landowners.
Sure. I started working on this topic kind of back in 2002 when, coming from North Central Iowa, I'd worked in ag conservation for a number of years. And in 2002, I really learned that women in Iowa own half the land. They own or co-own half the land in Iowa. And I was astounded because as a longtime conservationist, we didn't see women represented in a lot of the agricultural conservation programs, or just a number of those aspects. And so that launched me into basically a long pursuit and a PhD and work afterwards, trying to figure out how to reach out to those women and bring them into the fold. And that really led me to the Women Learning Circle concept. And one of the big lessons learned is that when it comes to outreach on conservation topics, one size does not fit all. It really, really doesn't. It's not as simple as add women and stir to what we're normally doing. We need to make sure that we're holding meetings that are welcoming, and they're just by nature, they're going to look different. And so those of us who found our way into conservation and love all of the tech speak and all of the content that we've grown to know and love, just telling it louder to somebody else doesn't necessarily help them to love it. We need to change up how we approach meetings. So just think about it. It doesn't take a lot of stretching to imagine this, but if you imagine, I'm going to draw a bell-shaped curve here. This is my PowerPoint pointing on the screen. If you just imagine a bell-shaped population distribution curve, women who find value in meetings, in our traditional conservation meetings, ag conservation meetings that are dominated by men, will continue to do so. We found our way there and we're okay with that. But there are a lot of women who aren't tuned into that, and they're different. And so we're kind of at one end of the scale or the other. Wherever you put us, we're at the small end of the scale. And there's a lot of women who are not seeing themselves in our materials and our offerings. And so being able to see yourself in the possibilities of what can be done is a real critical piece that I see mistakes made in a lot of conservation outreach and offerings. One of the other lessons is that women can be very influential in making changes. Early on, we had some meetings in Wisconsin, and I happened to be in a meeting that was held again 2 years later. And we went around, did the introductions, and the woman said, well, I came to a meeting here a couple years back, and she said, I grew a backbone that I didn't know I had, and I'm back to grow another body part. She was transformed by that experience of learning that other women care as much as she did. It was just a conversation they'd never had. And so we found with Women Food and Ag Network research, and AFT has verified this through their research, that as much as 70% of the women will take an action to improve conservation on their land after a 1 day, if you think about it, 1 dose meeting. They just need that kind of support, but it doesn't take much. So it's an important piece. And then the last thing is that the women, you may not see them. We may not be out in front of the pack, but we play for the long game. Women are really good long-term investors. And I could go on, but I'll toss it back to Gabrielle and give you a chance to ask the next question.
Great. Well, I think that sets up, the wonderful kind of lessons learned, and I'm sure both of you could kind of continue to speak to that. But I think still in that thread, my next question is really around the challenges. I think, I shared these questions ahead of time, and I think I'm going to modify it a little bit on the fly, but I know you two can handle it. I want to specifically kind of speak to the challenges of kind of reaching those audiences. And I think that has a little bit to do with the challenges those audiences face, but if you could, you all could speak a little bit to sort of the challenges you've had in working with audiences, as Michael, you said, don't have a lot of trust or have experienced pretty negative things or family history of experiencing negative things. What are kind of the challenges in engaging with those folks? And then kind of Jean, same for you. So I'll pass it back to Mike.
The challenges that I find most individuals have, that's not me, because generally we are creatures of habit, and we build up a social network. And in that social network, we're very comfortable in that network. Use that social network fits our demographic. Whatever we are is generally what our social network is. But trying to reach someone outside of your particular social network is a tremendous challenge, because you do not necessarily know how to or feel comfortable with how to communicate outside of your social network. And for white people especially, if you're the majority in your area and trying to communicate with a Hispanic or a Black person or an Asian person or an Indigenous person, there's apprehension there. Making sure you don't say anything that's going to offend them, making sure that they hear you and they connect you and they ultimately have a certain level of trust for you. And if they're a minority population in terms of that area that you're working in, you're probably thinking more of the majority that you already work with and making sure they have the resources. And sometimes the minority gets the minority view, gets the minority interest, the minority amount of calls in that process as well. And, it's not nothing personal, it's just a level of comfort, usually from your experiences. I feel much more comfortable talking to a 35, 40-year-old Black person my age than a 75-year-old white man or white woman. So trying to break down those barriers in terms of communicating is the first step that we have to do in terms of solving the problem, because there usually is a golden thread of sorts that you can find to communicate with, and that golden thread is something related to agriculture. If you remove all of the characteristics of that individual and just focus on the agriculture, the operation, the marketing, the GAP certification, or the conservation programs, or the conservation easements, or the taxes, the tax assistance, all those things are things we have to have in common with each other. And I think many times we find ourselves focusing more on the differences than on our commonalities. And we find those core commonalities, it's easier to, if there's a language barrier, you still got to do taxes. If there's a color barrier, you're still going to need markets and marketing. So these are all commonalities that we need to work toward, overcoming. Usually, again, the biggest challenge of overcoming these things is you've got ourselves and how we see the obstacle. And if you're laying down, looking at an obstacle, it can be, much more daunting if you actually stand up and realize all you gotta do is step over this step. But if you're laying down looking at the step, it looks like it's way too much, it's way too hard to kind of go over this step. So if we can remove our own obstacles in the process of, and our own obstacles in terms of how we view things, how we view the individual, the situation, the demographic, the location, the gender, we'll find ourselves making great strides, because we end up ultimately putting our own mental obstacles in the way, and that will slow us down from actually being able to reach those audiences in a meaningful way. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Michael. I might just, you said a lot of great stuff, but a couple of things that I just wanted to like hone in on, I think that really resonated for me was this idea of networks and trusted advisors. And I think that's always such an important sort of lesson of doing this kind of outreach work. For many of the folks who are in this training, you're going to be out doing more engagement and outreach in communities and thinking about what are the existing networks, who are the kind of trusted leaders in those spaces, and building new relationships, and also getting outside of your comfort zone, right? And being willing to look for those commonalities and the things that connect us. And I think the topic of this training, soil, is one of those places that I've often found in some of my own research too, is a fantastic way to kind of find common ground, quite literally. Anyways, I just wanted to highlight a couple of those pieces. I'll just pass it to Jean. What about some of the challenges that you've kind of faced reaching women, and if you want to mention sort of non-operating landowners specifically as well?
Sure. I love what Michael said about the social groups, because that is so true, and that piggybacks on what I'd like to say about landowners who are not active farmers. Their self-identity, if they've been selling insurance for the last 30 years and all of a sudden they've inherited the farm, they're not part of that ag community. They're not necessarily watching the conservation things. They might not even see farm magazines. They might not recognize any of those things. So thinking carefully and strategically about how we can reach into other networks is really, really a key to working with women. One of the things that I see conservation groups or, ag groups do is that if they pick out women, they'll pick out women as a case study. And 9 times out of 10, they're highlighting exceptional women who have had a leg up in some way, and making sure that you have opportunities for women to see very ordinary, less skilled other women will help encourage those who consider themselves less skilled and don't have a lot. It'll show them those little micro steps that they can take, because to go all the way to an easement is a giant step. But if I know that I need to start having conversations with these people and I need to start looking at these other steps, those are things that I might be able to manage and start down that pathway, knowing that women are really good long-term investors, that we play that long game, showing us those incremental steps, values that's a way that we're very effective working, because we can influence, we can be very influential on making those changes, but highlight what some of those small steps are. So don't just show the exceptional ones, the ones that had a silver spoon, the ones that, were born into, hunting family, and all of a sudden they already know all the stuff that they need to do for habitat. Do think about those folks that all of a sudden here they are, they're landowners and they have an attachment to the land, and the women they're leading with their heart. Keep them there, because that's a place where you can make decisions when you're really centered on that heart space. So I think that's a little piece. So non-operating landowners are a whole another animal, and you have to get into the social spaces where they are operating, because they may not think of themselves as a landowner. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with women about what I do for a living, and then they kind of go, "Oh, that's me." And it's just like, oh, yes, it is you. I'm done.
Well, maybe I'll keep it with Eugene for a minute and then pass it off. I think that because you're kind of already getting to the solutions, or kind of how folks are overcoming challenges and some of the strategies for meeting people where they are. But, you know, I'd be curious about some producers or landowners that you've worked with that have overcome some of the challenges, and that might also tie into the ways that you've overcome challenges and kind of meeting those folks where they are. And so, yeah, you know, I think I primed both you and Michael of, you know, any, you know, examples of individuals you've worked with or groups you've worked with who've kind of moved the needle on conservation or farmland preservation or anything kind of in this theme around kind of how they've met these big challenges in certain ways and had some successes.
There's two women that come to mind. One who came to a meeting, and then she promptly came to the next 3 meetings that we had, even if she had to drive all the way across the state to do it, because all of a sudden the light bulb had gone on for her. She had been estranged from, or at least pretty close to estranged from a lot of her family members when they broke up the estate. You know, when things were settled, you know, they all had to kind of be part of managing the farm, and she had different understandings about where that farm should be going, where should it be, how should it be managed. And her approach to the conversations with her family members put her on the outs, because she was asking hard questions about fertilizers and herbicides and things that they didn't want to be challenged on. And so once she came to a meeting and understood a little bit more of the context where her family members were coming from, then she learned some language. She was able to practice the terminology, test some ideas with a safe group. And she said it transformed her life. She could have conversations without getting estranged from her brother and brother-in-law. And so you never know when the smallest incremental change can be very transformative. So I know you have funders, they want to see acres, they want to see, you know, acres and acres of achievements. And a lot of times we don't measure the right things that allow us to see the accomplishments that women in particular have made. And another woman just talked to me this fall, and she said, I've been working trying to get my tenant to do cover crops for the past several years. She's brought it up, and he's just always kind of a little bit resistant. And this year, through somebody else, he didn't come and tell her directly, he started being open to cover crops, and he planted some this spring, and he's investing in equipment this year. But would he ever say that she was responsible for helping him make that change? No, but I know it was that constant drip, 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 drip. So there's another example of where women's work is often so very invisible that we don't often show it to each other. We don't hear those stories of that incremental change that's very effective. So I think that bringing those smaller steps to light is a real critical piece to helping across the board.
Thanks, Jean. And I love your previous suggestion, but I think it really goes well with what you just said about highlighting the case studies of the folks who aren't the rock stars. And I think that I'm taking that lesson to heart. I'm looking at some of my colleagues who I can see on Zoom, that we often, I think, do the same thing. We highlight these case studies of kind of the amazing producer, man, woman, whoever their identities are. And sometimes we forget that their experience may not be the average experience, and how do we create more opportunities to kind of uplift the stories of more average folks who've made an incremental step or who've had transformation, but in a different way. So I love that suggestion. Michael, I'd love to hear from you in terms of thinking about some of the successes you've seen people kind of tackling, huge challenges.
Well, I think most of the farmers have tackled these type of challenges. And if you look back, just reflect back to 2 years ago this time, how many of us were on Zoom calls on a regular basis? The reality is that, we have to plan out how we want to approach reaching our audience. You know, when COVID hit, you know, it was probably a 30 to 60 day window where there were limited interactions, workshops, conferences, et cetera, because we hadn't had a plan about how to reach out to these individuals. But eventually Zoom and Google and Microsoft Teams and all these other ideas came to mind about how we can still reach our audience. And it takes a certain amount of planning, and more importantly, it takes a certain amount of listening. And I think that's where we really fall short when we try to approach different audiences. As opposed to listening, we're looking to just offer solutions. It's the man way of approaching things. We want to immediately, and I speak from a man's perspective, we want to immediately offer solutions to a problem as opposed to listening to what the issue is. Because sometimes if you read the Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, the understanding that, you know, sometimes women just want to vent. They just want to share what's on their mind. They're not looking for a man to solve anything. However, as extension agents, we're always looking to solve something. Every time we approach, everybody's laughing, but it's true. We're always looking to solve a problem as opposed to listening to, you know, what the need of this community is, what the need of this farmer is. And from there, you can make a better assessment of how to assist them. Maybe they just need to hear about the programs. Maybe they just need to have somebody to vent off, you know, talk about the government, talk about the state policies and the governor and COVID, and then they can go on about their way. But listening to these individuals are going to help tremendously. I think there's not enough focus groups for these target audiences to really take a time to listen. And unfortunately, how we work is too much into a deliverable time space. These issues didn't, you know, come about in a year, 2 years, 3 years, in a season. They came out over hundreds of years. And now we're expecting to solve it or having some type of tangible results in 6 months. That's unrealistic to everybody. You know, it's just not. We have to kind of really lessen. I mean, I know our funders and, you know, we'll be the USDA, private foundations, always looking to have results to show to their stakeholders and say, this money is put to good use. But somehow, some way, we have to approach this a little differently. That, you know, deliverables work well, but they're not feasible. Deliverables and farmers are not cabbage. You can't plant a seed, you know, in July and expect a harvest in October, November. It's just not going to happen with us in reality. You know, we've got to look at it from a long-term, solution-based oriented, listening-based oriented way of solving this problem. Because those are probably the biggest challenges we face. And how do we solve that? Just by listening. And then taking back what we heard, not in a personal way, but in a way of understanding. Because many times you may feel attacked when people tell you some things that you may not want to hear. And almost 100% of the time, it's never personal. It's just people trying to express their, you know, frustrations with the system, with their realities, with their farm operation. Farming is very hard work. There are individuals who are, you know, who don't have health care, who don't have labor, who are, you know, under high levels of stress when you come to talk to them. And what you're hearing is a level of stress that you're receiving from them, not personal towards you, but just the reality of running a small business. And we have to take all those things into consideration to try to help our growers. And I hope I answered the question. But just remember that we are from Mars. Farmers are from Venus. Extension workers are from Mars.
I love that. Taking that metaphor in new places, Michael. And I really appreciate your kind of recommendation of taking time to listen and not just listen, but kind of digest what we hear and put that into practice. And especially when working with new audiences where we, you know, I think you're right. So much of the drive of how we get funding in a lot of different settings maybe doesn't set us up for great success that way, but how can we push back on those pieces to engage in a longer dialogue? Giving me lots of things to think about personally, and I hopefully for the audience here too. For the final question, I want to kind of put it to the audience to also respond to, and then I'll give Michael and Jean an opportunity to give some final thoughts. So the question is about, you know, what are there opportunities in your work, in your field, in your organization where you see a chance to engage in more and with more diverse audiences, particularly around soil health and, you know, farmland preservation. So I put that question in Pathable, but I welcome any brave individuals to raise your hand, and I won't be afraid to sort of pick on at least some of my colleagues who I know if I need to do that.
So I'm the new land manager for Cardinal Land Conservancy, and one opportunity that just came up is we were gifted the last working farm in the city limits of Cincinnati. So we it's like a 32-acre farm, and we've like taken over like I guess like operations, but it's in a food desert, and I think that like that's been like a good way of like engaging people and also remedying a problem like that there isn't access to fresh produce, or like we also have like a refugee program running out of it so that people can grow foods that are like culturally appropriate that they can't find in grocery stores. So that's been like a really, really cool opportunity that I've been happy with.
Great, Noel, thank you. And feel free if folks have things like that, and you can put it in the chat so that other folks can look into it if there are models that are interesting. Other thoughts about current opportunities or future opportunities you might want to explore?
You know, we've been talking about this conversation for quite a while, and there were several sort of ideas we've had, sort of looking at urban gardening from, you know, helping to put in new community gardens in the underserved communities, especially since food deserts are such a huge issue on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. And we have some expertise and connections in the ag community to help educate people about how to be successful at small plot farming. And, you know, we've looked at those kind of concepts. We haven't reached a point where those are actionable yet, but we've looked at that. And then we've also looked at buying farms with the idea to divide them up for diverse landowners to use from a rental perspective or even from an ownership perspective. So we've looked at a couple ideas, but we haven't quite reached actionable stage yet.
Looks like Michelle Cable's got a hand up.
Go for it, Michelle.
Great, thanks. So I'm also with Maryland, the Department of Agriculture and our Ag Land Preservation Program. And while it's not in our group, Maryland a few years ago did start a program that's called the Next Generation Program. So one of the biggest challenges of getting people on the land is being able to afford to buy land. So there is a program in Maryland that basically, if some of your states have like a critical farms program, so it's a pot of money that will hopefully be a revolving fund that allows access for about 50% of the purchase price of the land to go to these new, it was originally called the Young Farmer, but as a state program, you can't discriminate on age. So it's a new farmer program. So you can be an older person and still be eligible if you don't have any farming experience, but it really is geared to get that next generation people to be able to afford to buy the land, to then have the opportunities to work it. And it ultimately ends with a conservation easement through one of the other state programs as well. Just last year, there's a subset of this program that is a small acreage side of it as well, because there was an acreage minimum to try to get more of that kind of the smaller ones, a little bit more suburban, urban possibilities as well. So trying to find ways to get people to be able to afford to have the ownership of that land. And so far it's been working out pretty well.
That's super helpful. Thank you, Michelle. I see Michael, go for it.
Very good, thank you. And I just wanted to kind of address and just talk about, you know, a little bit that you've mentioned about the food deserts. I work with University of Maryland Eastern Shore as well, so I'm familiar with that area and kind of how we go about doing things. I understand that food deserts is an issue, but I like to turn that around in many cases. Is where's the demand for the food? Is there a value that's placed on the food to make individuals appreciate what you're doing? What I see a lot of times with food deserts is there's food supplied or given away, which only increases the food desert size. because most individuals usually look at things in terms of value. And what they put their value on is what they generally want to spend their money on to support. And what ends up happening is that we often are either asked or kind of forced in some ways to give away food, either from the farmer or from an organization who's paid something from the farmer. But the end result is the lowering of value of our product. And as a farmer, you know, I'll put in these terms that maybe you may understand, maybe you won't. But if you ever go to a liquor store, I've never been to a liquor store, but if you ever been to a liquor store, there is a brand of liquor, I'm sure, across the United States called Aristocrat. Aristocrat is a certain level of alcohol, and then you have other, what they call top shelf alcohols. Many people appreciate the top shelf alcohol because of the perceived value of those products. Yet many people shun the aristocratic alcohol. And I see kind of produce in the same manner. When you're giving things away or things has a very low value, the appreciation of it in the community is just not there. And ultimately that affects the farmer, because once these programs dry up, you know, with USDA and others taking produce from farmers and then giving it to other communities that are very low or no cost, farmers are going to be in the same situation again of not having any value for their crops. So they grow the crops and no one wants them because we haven't satiated or created a proper demand for those products. I work with many individuals who work in food deserts. I've lived in food deserts, but I always stress that the supply and demand aspect of food deserts is the biggest problem we have to tackle. The reason why there generally is a lower supply of certain things is because the demand is very low. So individuals coming from a free market standpoint are not seeing the profit in making sure that fresh produce are in certain communities. Because I ran a community grocery store in Capitol Heights, Maryland, and in Northwest Washington, D.C. And that was the first thing we had to shut down was the grocery store part because the demand was not there, and you lose money with rotting vegetables. So as we approach how we approach food deserts, I think, you know, we have to look at it from a economic standpoint, and more importantly, of why the demand is so low for these fresh vegetables.
Thank you for that, Michael. I raised some really important points, and I'll make sure that everyone has Michael and Jean's contact information, because if folks want to follow up on some of these threads, I really appreciate, the fact that we don't have enough time to cover all of them. I just did want to acknowledge that there are a few questions that come across on chat, and if we don't get to them here, we'll try to respond later, because it's just hard to do all, and I know we're coming up on time. So I just wanted to give Jean and then Michael another chance if you all want to add anything to this sort of final word on kind of more opportunities or additional opportunities you see in this space.
I'll jump in and just say that particularly when it comes to soil health, if we continue and I'm saying we as the conservation community, if we continue to say farmers and landowners in one breath, I can guarantee that the image that comes to mind is white male farmers. Even though we say landowners, when we put those two together, they get conflated. And that gives me, as a woman landowner, I do own farmland. It gives me a free pass because, you know, that's somebody else. That's not me. I don't, you know. So think about ways to strategically word your outreach so that you put the responsibility squarely back on my shoulders. If I own the land, it's my responsibility to help clean up the water, to help make sure that the soil is doing what it should do. It's my responsibility if I own it. It's not my responsibility if all I have to do is sit back and collect the check because it's cash rent and you're talking about farmers and landowners and they own land, and that's not me. So make sure you put us back in that picture and put that responsibility back on our shoulders. That's where it belongs.
That's great. Thank you, Jean. Yeah, clarify who you mean, who is your audience, and make sure they see themselves in it. Michael, any other final thoughts on this topic?
Always got plenty of final thoughts, so I'll try to limit it to 35, 40 seconds. But I'd encourage you, again, as we approach these new ideas, we still have to continuously think out the box. Since my involvement in the agriculture industry in the United States for the last couple of years now, I've seen a lot of activity, but I haven't seen a lot of change. And we kind of, at this point as organizations, our success is when we receive funds. It's not necessarily what those funds have impacted to make change. And that's a very troubling situation because you continue to perpetuate the same things that you're trying to champion or change in that process. But many would say, you know, we've come a long way. But the real question is, are we going the right way? And that's the key aspect that we have to look at as change agents, as extension agents of those in the agricultural landscape and whatever aspect. Are we going in the right direction? Because no matter how far we come, we're not going in the right direction, we're definitely going in the wrong direction.
Thank you for that. Well, I want to thank Michael and Jean. I will make sure folks have their contact information. I know they both also do consulting and further education on topics we covered today, so I'll give a plug for them in that space. Chris, I know you wanted to have the final word. So thanks again to Chris and Beth and the whole team who made this happen, for all of you being here today in the last session of the day. I hope you got some good things to ponder and reflect on.
Great. Well, thank you, Gabrielle. I want to make note of two questions that we didn't get to. One is, and you might have not seen them, Gabrielle. One was from David Booz, who had a question for Michael. At the risk of Michael asking you to answer this in a very short amount of time, let me raise it, which is, I was impressed, this is David speaking, I was impressed to read of your work in Ghana, Kenya, and Israel. Have you been able to work with Africans who have come to America and want to bring their agricultural knowledge and start farming operations here?
That's a great question. I just had to make sure I was not muted. I have worked with some agriculturalists from Africa. I've talked to them. I work with them quite frequently. It's kind of a different reality of working with individuals here, because most of the individuals who come here are generally highly educated from Africa, and their desire to work in agricultural space is usually not high. There's dodo farms in Bethesda. There was a refugee camp of individuals coming from out of Burundi who I work with a little bit as well. So I have worked with some. I would love to work with more because the indigenous knowledge from Africa is tremendous. And if you know of any individuals in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area who are looking to work with a farm or any of that, please send them my contact information. I would love to work with them.
Great. Thank you so much. That is very helpful, Michael. The last question was, there was a question here from Lauren about, does AFT do any work to support increased BIPOC land ownership? Again, I don't want to get into long details now. What I am going to do is to put into the chat, or I guess into the files, a link to our comments to USDA on racial equity that includes in those comments on the policy front, which I am the most versed in, is the suggestions that we have made to the transition team and to Congress and to USDA about things that they can do to be supportive and do more to promote racial equity in a variety of their programs. So let me just stop there, and I will put that in the link somewhere, although I can't multitask and do it right now. But to wrap up, because we're just a tiny bit beyond time, thank you so much, Michael. Thank you, Jean, and thank you, Gabrielle. That was great. It was a great way to end the afternoon.